Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. By the time Vladimir Putin's current presidential term ends, he will have dominated Russian politics for a quarter century. And already there is talk of maneuvers to ensure his grip on power is maintained beyond 2024. He is the world's greatest exponent of strongman rule. Well, my guest today has spent the Putin years in thankless, fruitless opposition. Grigory Yavlinsky's brand of liberal economics and political reform has failed to take root. Is it because, unlike Putin, he doesn't speak to Russia's heart? Grigory Yavlinsky, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you for the invitation.
You have had many years, I guess you would say too many years, to consider why Vladimir Putin has succeeded and you, in politics in Russia, have consistently failed. What is the key to understanding that?
History of Russia is a very long story, and tradition in Russia, as you know, is not very liberal. And I'm fighting for a new era in Russia, for liberal reforms, for human rights, for justice, for divisions of powers. That never happens in Russia. But I'm doing that only for 30 years. It's not enough.
Is it your conclusion that the Russian people simply aren't interested in some of the concepts that you've just outlined, justice, human rights? Is that not appealing to the Russian public?
I think that Russian people is not very different from all the other people in Europe or in North America. But there is no tradition, no experience, and no fruitful results of the economic reforms in the 90s. Just opposite. The economic reforms in Russia, with the support of the world, created Putin system itself. The system where is the merger, government, property, and business, all together, in the same just cup.
And yet, when we look at Russian politics today and your role in it, we cannot but look at the evidence of elections and opinion polls. You, as long ago as 1996, ran for the presidency of Russia, and you scored let's say a respectable 7% or so. The last time you ran, in the last election in 2018, you scored the rather pathetic outcome of 1%. Vladimir Putin, of course, consistently scores over 60%.
Yes, but from 96 to 2018, the procedure of elections deteriorated extremely. It's nothing have in common with the presidential elections anymore. It's a kind of plebiscite about Putin. But
that may be so, and the plebiscite says the Russian people like what they see.
Right. No, it's saying that they don't see alternative. There is no alternative on the screens of Russian media. Russian media is completely over-monopolized. It's the one thing, and the other thing, we have economic growth when the oil prices were more than $120 a barrel. So this combination of these two things, of course, made a special vision of the people. But the main thing is that in Putin's system, there is no political competition. And I was taking part in the elections to have an opportunity to speak to the people, to say them, in Russian, of course, the same things which I'm telling to you.
Yeah, but I'm looking at the arc of history, not just in Russia, but around the world in recent years. And surely one can conclude that Vladimir Putin saw much earlier than many other politicians the power of marrying a very strong authoritarian tone to a nationalist and populist message. He wove nationalism into his political offer. Now, you and the liberals in Russia, as I said at the very beginning of this program, have completely failed, it seems to me, to connect on an emotional and maybe even nationalistic level with your own people.
To some extent, you're right, but I want to say that what happens with Putin and his ideas in the world is not his advantage. It's a disadvantage of the world politics.
Russia today looks stronger than it has looked for many, many years, both to Russians inside your country and indeed to many observers outside of Russia who see Vladimir Putin in the Middle East, for example, even in recent chaotic situations like Venezuela, projecting Russian power.
Yes. It's not about Russian power. It's about influence, which can Russia just put in the world politics in the situation with the impotence of the world politics. Simply, world leaders are absolutely not prepared to do anything with the complicated problems, as you know. I'm not going to speak about just Mr. Trump with North Korea, or Great Britain with the Brexit, or France with the yellow jackets, or Poland with the nationalism, or Hungary with the same thing. It's spreading everywhere. So
yes,
it's
it is
a problem.
Spreading everything, but my point is that Vladimir Putin has tapped into something extremely powerful in your country. And if we start with Ukraine, close to home, on the border, a country which Russia has always seen as part of its wider sphere of influence, in 2014, when Vladimir Putin decisively decided to send troops into Crimea and indeed send some troops into eastern Ukraine as well, the Russian public absolutely loved it, and the annexation of Crimea has kept his popularity high ever since.
First of all, not everybody in Russia liked that.
Well, not everybody.
Not
Look
everybody.
at the polls.
Not
And
everybody. A big number of people, but not everybody. Secondly, it's what happens, at least, I would say, in the eastern Ukraine, it's a crime. Thousands of people, dozens of thousands of people is killed there.
You have said that.
So
you've said the annexation, never mind Donbass and everything else, you said quite clearly the annexation of Crimea itself is an unlawful act.
Absolutely.
Crimea is not ours.
Absolutely. Annexation of Crimea is unlawful act. There is no doubt in that. But it's necessary to clarify that to the world and to the people.
And I admire, if I may say so, I admire your determination to speak out when you are swimming against a very strong tide. But nonetheless, if we look at the impact of what your position has had upon your politics, you are portrayed by Putin's people, and indeed by many others in Russia, as somebody who is fundamentally unpatriotic, who is betraying the interests of the Russian nation.
This is not true because, and they know that, because I'm trying to look for the future of Russia, not only for today. Strategically, what happens in Crimea, in Donbass, and mostly in Syria is a trap. Is a trap of the future of Russia. This is the point. This is a key point. We are losing, with that kind of politics, Russia is losing its future.
Well, you say that. The Economist magazine, which isn't given to hyperbole in these matters, recently wrote, as a result of Russia's policy in Syria in particular, there is, quote, a new swagger about Russia in the wider world. They've said Moscow has turned into a center of significant Middle East diplomacy, i.e. The Economist magazine sees Vladimir Putin exercising a real authority, turning Russia into a credible player in strategic politics of the Middle East.
There are two things to say. First, it's just a very short view. It's not for a long time. For in a long term, Soviet Union was about 15 years. About 10 years was in Afghanistan and lost there 15,000 lives. And what happens at the end? All that collapsed. So, but you can say that in the middle of this 10 years, Soviet Union was in the middle everywhere. He was the strongest. He was fighting. Sometimes it happens with Americans in Vietnam, with the Russians, with the Soviets in Afghanistan. Today, Russians are in Syria. But it's a very, very difficult situation from the point of view of consequences.
I see what you're saying, and of course, you know, pessimism sometimes is very well justified, but you're in the unfortunate position of, with your views, you're sort of suggesting that the Russian people are being idiots, because I've looked at the opinion poll evidence and I've dug into it a little bit, and the most recent surveys of opinion show that Russian people have a plus 34 approval rating for Vladimir Putin, quote, strengthening Russia militarily. They have a plus 29 approval rating for Putin improving Russia's international standing. So they don't buy your pessimism.
So, two things. Once again, two things. First, Russia have no opinion polls. Forget about that. Don't use that. In authoritarian system, opinion polls by the state agency and halfly state agencies is not possible.
But Russia isn't North Korea. I mean, you, Mr. Yavlinsky, when you go home, you can speak to newspapers. There are certain radio stations that will put you on air.
Yes.
It's not North Korea.
I can speak to one newspaper and to one radio station. And I can't make that kind of interview in Russian television. It's not possible at all. At all. That's why I was taking part in the so-called presidential elections, to be able to say something to the people. Now, secondly, what I want to say, you know, not only problem with the opinion polls, but also sometimes it happens that for a long time looks like a complete failure in politics. Mr. Churchill was in that position some time.
I see. So you're saying to me your time is yet to come, despite the fact you've been in politics the last 30 years.
What I want to say, my time, I'm not sure, but the time of my ideas for sure will come.
Let's think about Russia's status one more time, and let's think about what we see. And again, you say surveys aren't important. To me, they sometimes can be telling. 70% of Russians now say they believe Joseph Stalin played a positive role in their country's history. There is something going on here about Russia's attraction to stability, to a strongman rule, if I can put it that way, authoritarianism, if you want to call it that, which actually, for Russian people, when they look back in history and look at their country today, is delivering.
Yes, Russians are just taking this stance because, and this view, because current Putin system is based on some principles which were created by Stalin. And the principles like ends justify the means, the people are not important, the life or death is not important anymore. So many things, rights, there is no rights, there is no system of justice, there is no system of laws. It's only like a decoration. Yes, we have a decoration, which very looks like in the Western countries, but in the substance, it is still a power or one personality.
But you said yourself that Russians have very strong and clear memories of the chaos of the 1990s. They remember the absolute poverty, the destitution that came with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the crony capitalism and the anarchy that we saw in the mid-90s. You were a reformer at the time. You wanted a market-based system. Maybe you didn't want the chaos, but you're associated with those failures. And what we see with Vladimir Putin today is that maybe it's a stagnant economy, but it's a stable economy. It has low debt, low deficits. Indeed, the IMF praises Russia for its responsible management of the public finances.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The way of reforms which they were accomplished in the 90s was wrong. Now a lot of people understand that. And they created, as I told you before, this system, the system of mafia state. Russia today is a kind of a mafia state.
Right, but in the mid-90s, 30% of Russians lived in poverty, and now it's down to 12 or 13%. You know, Russia's people measure the reality of Putin's Russia today against what they remember of that chaotic period, and frankly, they still stick with Putin today.
Yes, that is right, but that doesn't mean that this is their choice forever. It's just if to compare along the strong propaganda, it's an understandable outcome of that. But you can recall what happens in Europe in 30s with Italy, with Mussolini, for example. I'm not speaking about Germany. It's a very special case. But let's speak a little bit about Italy, about Mussolini. Everybody was so happy with him. Everybody was voting for him. Everybody was supporting him. The Western countries were so happy because there were no unemployment, economic growth. But that is the way to nowhere. Now it is clear.
I just wonder, again, I'm thinking about how the Russian opposition changes the dynamic, because you'd be the first to agree that, frankly, right now, you're not gaining traction. You know, your opinion poll standings, if you care about them, are incredibly low, and there's no sign of momentum growing on the streets or anywhere else. Maybe it's time for you to come up with a different economic message, which is less pro-Western, less addicted to sort of neoliberal Western economic arguments, and is more intrinsically Russian in its character.
I'm not trying to implement Western recipe or Western model. What I'm speaking about the model which is necessary for Russia. Whether it is like Western or not like Western at the moment, it is not so important.
Well, it is in the minds of many Russians, because they seem to see the world.
There is in the minds of many Russians because Putin system is trying to penetrate in the brains. And look, you know that everybody is saying in the world that Putin is trying to influence American elections. And Americans are almost crazy about that.
Oh.
So you can imagine what he can do in Russia. How he can influence this opinion polls, how he can influence all the other things in the elections, in the results of the elections. So it's not about what is he doing. My point is what is necessary for my country.
Yeah, I understand that, and I'm just trying to get my head around where you go from here. Because with respect, you and I have talked before years ago, and frankly, you haven't really made political headway in the years since. And I've obviously, over the years, I've spoken to people like Garry Kasparov, the late Boris Nemtsov, who I interviewed a couple of times, and of course we know what happened to him, gunned down just outside the Kremlin.
Strong country, strong Putin.
But my point was that all of you, powerful, charismatic individuals who have failed to connect, it seems to me, with Russia's electorate. Now, the one man I have interviewed who did seem to strike a real connection was Alexei Navalny, because his message is, it seems to me, more nationalistic. It has a more Russian component to it. Navalny wasn't allowed to run in the presidential election last time around. You were. But should you be learning some lessons from Navalny?
No. Full stop.
Because?
No. Because nationalism for Russia means war. Sooner or later. That's it. That's the point.
Do you think then, if you see an unacceptable nationalism alongside authoritarianism in the Putin regime, that Russia is ultimately on a track to war?
That's what I want to underline. It's a real threat.
In Ukraine or where?
It can happen everywhere. In Iran, for example, when 120,000 military would come from United States, as they are just discussing at the moment, or somewhere in Syria, or in Ukraine, easily, or somewhere else. This is the nature of that kind of a system. And this is a question of time. Sooner or later, it comes to that point. And if you just make a record of Mr. Putin, what he's saying on this issue, you will see clearly that he is prepared for that. And he's looking for the opportunity for that.
I'm just thinking to myself, perhaps Vladimir Putin has BBC World News in the Kremlin. Perhaps he's watching this interview right now. Perhaps he's heard you making a comparison with Winston Churchill and saying, let's not forget, Winston Churchill spent decades in the political wilderness before he came to power. And
when he came, when tragic things...
Do you think when Vladimir Putin listens to you say that and say that my politics, my ideas will have their time in Russia and it will come, do you think he takes you seriously or do you think he laughs at you?
I think he knows that. He agrees with that. But he don't know what to do. He's in the corner. He put himself in the corner, in the dead end. He absolutely knows that I'm right, that not about myself, but that idea is the only future for Russia.
So here,
you know that.
Here is the question for you, if you are to have credibility. You explain to me how you think it is that the system, because you're focused not just on Putin as an individual, but the system, how is the system going to be fundamentally challenged and dismantled by the opposition in Russia?
This is the main and key question. What would happen after Putin? This is the key question. Because if the system would stay in place, then would come another person after Putin, but nothing would be changed. Even worse. It would be even worse than now.
Running the same machine.
Absolutely.
So my question is this. What is it that will bring down this machine? Is it street action? Is it popular resistance? Because it isn't going to be the ballot box, because you say that elections are completely false and rigged.
Absolutely. The main question for today, and the main issue for today, is to create the big, large, political, civil, democratic opposition party. That's what I'm doing. It's very difficult.
You're at 1% in the polls.
It doesn't matter. Don't believe Russian polls. But it doesn't matter. Maybe half of the percent of the polls. It doesn't matter. You're asking me what is necessary to do. I'm telling you what is necessary to do. It is necessary for the first time in the history of Russia to create the civil, political, democratic force. That kind of a force, maybe this is not for the first time, second time, which started and completed successful and peaceful reforms 30 years ago. 30 years ago. It happens only once.
We're out of time.
It's not about me.
You do it?
We are talking about ideas. Okay. Maybe me, maybe some other people would come, but that's what is needed today.
Grigory Yavlinsky, we have to end there, but I thank you very much for being on.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.